Composition of a Killer fans. Dr. Cassidy here. Today we're going to be talking about nurses who kill. And as I said in the promo, we're veering off of the juvenile serial killer series, just because this is some fresh information about nurses in the healthcare field who turn out to be serial killers, and some new statistics that are just fascinating. As always, just want to remind you that everything we talk about in this podcast is my professional opinion. It is not a clinical diagnosis. All right, so many of us know about Lucy Letby, who was the most recent serial killer, nurse serial killer in Great Britain. And she was convicted of killing babies, infants, and she was sentenced to life. But that has called into question a lot of people asking, why would these nurses, why do they become murderers? What happens to cause them to do that? Well, let's look back at some of the most prolific nurses who became serial killers, and then look into the psyche of what they did and why they did it. One of the first serial killer nurses that we learned about was Niles Hogel. He was actually working in German hospitals and murdered around 85 patients. And he became what is thought to be the country's most prolific peacetime serial killer. Hogel, who was jailed for life on June the 6th, this was of 2019, is the latest in a long list of healthcare professionals put in prison for taking the lives of those in their care. One simple question arises above all else in the case of Hogel and others like him. Why did they kill? Offenders rarely talk, and even when they do, we should be cautious about believing them, says Elizabeth Yardley, who's the professor of criminology at Birmingham City University. An offender may claim to have taken a patient's life to end their suffering. That is how American nurse Charles Cullen, who admitted killing at least 29 patients, explained his behavior, although this was discredited as some of his victims were in recovery. Their words are not truths, but performances, Yardley said. Others may kill in order to get rid of what they see as difficult patients. In a confession, Canadian killer nurse Elizabeth Wetlaufer described feeling deep anger at her 8 victims, whom she injected with fatal doses of insulin. Her first victim was James Silcox, an 84-year-old patient who struggled with dementia. He was killed in September of 2007. That evening, I got the urge to overdose James, Wetlaufer said. At approximately 7:30, I decided to overdose him with insulin, hoping he would die. There's also what criminologist David Wilson calls hero syndrome, and he says that Hogel showed signs of that Munchausen syndrome by proxy, and it's not known by that now. We don't call it Munchausen's for a number of reasons. It's actually called factitious disorder imposed on another, or FDIA. It's also known as fabricated or induced illness by carers, or FII. And it's a mental health disorder in which a caregiver creates the appearance of health problems in another person, and typically their child. If you ever watched, what was the name of that show? I'm looking it up. The Act. It was called The Act. And it was the story of Dee Dee Blanchard and Gypsy Rose, if you remember that. Gypsy Rose actually she is either getting ready to be released or she has already been released. But Dee Dee Blanchard, of course, was her mother, and she forced her daughter to fake a series of illnesses in order to garner um, money and homes. I mean, she got a home from Habitat for Humanity. All kinds of things. She had her daughter's teeth pulled and they were perfectly healthy. She had her put on feeding tubes, just really horrific things that she did to her daughter. But really, in the name of getting attention and being able to scam people out of things. She was on, Make a Wish. She got her wish. All kinds of things like that happened. And then Gypsy Rose, as she got older, became a teenager, and she found out that um, she was older than what her mother said she was. She really became quite vindictive. Got a boyfriend that she met online, and then she ended up talking him into killing her mother. So she's actually in jail. She was in jail for that. Her boyfriend is in jail for, or former boyfriend is in jail for life. But he was also, he had some mental delays as well. So even though he got life, I'm sure he still is in treatment for rehabilitation, which is what their overall goal is anyway. But speaking back about Hogel, prosecutors said that Hogel attacked patients in order to impress colleagues by subsequently trying to revive them. He even earned the nickname Resuscitation Rambo. Catherine Ramsland, a professor of forensic psychology, said there are differences in why a doctor might kill in comparison to a nurse. Doctors often kill from the desire to feel like a godlike sense of power over patients or from experimental curiosity. Nurses, on the other hand, often feel put upon and undervalued. Their killing sprees appear to have other motives, such as gaining attention, finding a small realm of power in an otherwise powerless world, assuaging depression, paying back an unfair system, and acting out to relieve frustration or workload. Kenneth Iverson, he's the author of Demon Doctors, Physicians as Serial Killers, said the doctors he studied all seemed to feel that everyone in the world existed only for their own benefit. And interestingly, Ramsland actually, in her study of all of these nurses and doctors, came up with a checklist, a 22-point checklist of red flags that have been associated with healthcare serial killers. Again, this is like our ACEs scores. It's a checklist. This is like our McDonald triad. It's a list. It's just these commonalities among these people that she's put together. And they include predicting when a patient will die, moving from one hospital to another, preferring night shifts, trying to prevent others from checking their patients, and being associated with incidences at other hospitals. And though a few of these would not be alarming in isolation, Professor Wilson said a cluster of 5 or more would be a cause for concern. And that's exactly the same as, the ACEs. Just because someone scores high on the ACEs, it does not mean that they're going to become a violent offender. The likelihood of it happening is greater. So statistically, the higher the number, the more problems you're going to have in life. And again, McDonald triad, same thing. The more of those characteristics a person exhibits, the more likely they are to become a serial killer. But if you have a child who is fascinated with fire, that doesn't necessarily mean that he or she is going to become a serial killer. It really needs to be multiple characteristics. And of course, in this case, Wilson says a cluster of 5 or more would be a cause for concern. Cullen, remember, he's the American serial killer. He displayed half of the 22 traits, according to a report by Wilson and Yardley. When serial killing medical professionals are finally unmasked, it becomes clear that many people recognized red flags along the way, Iserson said. But he adds some of the perpetrators got away with multiple murders simply because authorities in various jurisdictions did not communicate with each other. What does this sound like? It it goes along with my thought process and my opinion that the judicial system, they don't communicate with each other. It is a broken system. Mental health system, exactly the same. Um, there's also this mitigating factor of nurse shortages in both UK and the US that have been cited as a reason for proper checks being overlooked. We see that in education too, where we're saying, well, this person may not be the best teacher, but we don't have anybody else to take their place. So we're going to leave them there, maybe give them a little bit of instruction, but really, we just need a warm body in the classroom, and that's what we're going to do. And that's very, very common. Um, and it's doing nothing for the profession. However, I found it just very interesting that we have almost the exact same thing happening in the healthcare field. That we know there's a nurse shortage, and here's the difference. This is just a pet peeve of mine and many other educators that I talk to on a regular basis. To combat that, the healthcare field has significantly increased the pay that a nurse gets. So they're drawing people into the field to help with the shortage because they're getting paid just an exorbitant amount of money to do. I mean, it's a hard job. Don't get me wrong. You have to be, very educated. You have to be very skilled. But they're buying people into the system to help with that. The difference in the education field is we do not have the money to up our salaries so that we can draw more people into the profession. You're talking about a profession that, like a nurse, there's so many things, there's so many parts to it, there's so many moving parts. And a teacher, an educator, has to be a parent, they have to be a counselor, they have to be the educator, they have to be, a little bit of everything just to get through a day. And I've gotten into some online arguments, which I know I should not do. I shouldn't engage. But when someone talks about education and how teachers have one job and all they do is teach and they shouldn't be doing anything else, that person is greatly misinformed. In order for us to have a classroom that works, a learning environment, we have to build relationships with those children. We have to know them almost as well as their parents or guardians know them. It is not easy. There's nothing easy about the profession, but yet we can't pay you $2,000 a week to come in and teach because we just don't have that kind of money in education. They do have it in healthcare, however, and that's what you're seeing. You're seeing people, they're pulling in people, and I'm not saying that they're pulling in a lesser quality of people. I'm not sure if there is any research on, let's say, these serial killers that work in healthcare. Were they interested in this career because of the money, and then they got into it and they have like this narcissistic background that causes them to decide that they're going to be angels of mercy? That's a terminology that's very common for these people. They're considered, they call themselves angels of mercy because they think they're helping the patient by killing them. Of course, we know that's not true, but it's fascinating the parallels in these two professions, and the ways that we have, as a whole field, how we've tried to address those things. So you don't want the quality of your educators to decrease because you're taking just anybody off the street. And likewise, you don't want nurses in the field who are there for any other reason than to be a servant in the healthcare field. We're both in service industries. We serve people, and you have to have a different kind of mentality. You